Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So today we talk about genre a little bit more. Our reading from the book is called Cinema and Genre, and it's kind of a review of a few things that we've already talked about because we've already mentioned a few of the popular genres in the early days of movies. And as I've pointed out, some of these genres are still with us. So we're pretty familiar with certain movie genres, and I think we're pretty familiar with the concept, the larger idea of genre. Because even if we haven't thought about it a whole lot before, if we've watched different kinds of movies, we are familiar with the idea of genre. These are different types or kinds of movies. And as we know, genre is very important. That's why we want to jump into it a little bit more this week. We often use genre not just to categorize films, although that is an important function that it serves, but also, as the book points out, genre often sort of dictates or at least influences our expectations when we go into a movie in terms of what we want from that movie, what we expect that movie to do. So in a lot of ways, genre helps to shape not just the movies themselves, but they also shape how audiences respond to the movies. So we want to explore that stuff a little bit more today. And our film for the week is an example of a comedy. It's from the Marx Brothers. It's called Duck Soup, one of their classic films from the 1930s. So we'll talk a little bit more about that particular brand of comedy, why it was popular back then, and we might see a few remaining traces, a few influences from the Marx Brothers that definitely still show up today. But let's think a little bit more about genre here to start. So the word comes from French, and it literally means kind or type. So if we've ever read books, if we've ever watched movies, we have encountered this concept of genre. It is a very important part of interpreting literature and film. So we can think of genre in a few different ways. And if we're thinking about books, if we're thinking about writing, there's a few different ways to differentiate different kinds of genres. So in some cases, writing might be separated into fiction and nonfiction. So that's a way to use genre based on relationship to reality. And we've talked about this split a little bit before when it comes to movies. A lot of early movies were really more nonfiction, right? They weren't trying to tell original stories that had been invented by a screenwriter or a director. Instead, they were just documenting real life. So what they were showing was real, not fiction. And then later, as movies progressed and got more sophisticated, a little bit more advanced, we started to see more and more fiction films. Films that had a made-up premise, a made-up story that was made to seem real. And we've talked about this kind of a strange phenomenon, but humans have adapted to it over the last several, millennia. We take something that we know is not real, but we suspend our disbelief so we can sort of experience it as real. We get invested in the characters, in the plot, in the themes, even if it's fiction. So that's one way to use genre to differentiate two different kinds of movies. We can see fiction, we can also see nonfiction. But typically we use genres more to think about stories, what the movies are about. So a lot of times our modern day usage of genre really boils down to what type of story are we looking at. But as the book points out, that hasn't always been the case, necessarily. In the very early days of movies, a lot of the genre differentiation was based on length, like length of the movie, in some cases topic, like what was maybe going on in the movie, and the idea of genre was very loose. So they mentioned early on, some movies might be called fight movies because they featured fight scenes. Or they might be referred to as one reel or two reel films, referencing their length. So those were in the very early days. But pretty soon, once we started getting feature-length movies, we started to see a lot of modern genres. By that I mean genres that are still around today. And these genres really refer to what types of plots and then what types of characters and themes we were going to be seeing in the movie. So like the book points out, a lot of basic genre terminology, as we knew it then and as we still know it now, is largely borrowed from novels and the theater, two older art forms that movies have borrowed very much from over the years, especially in these early days. So we recognize a lot of these genres still. Comedies, romance, melodrama, westerns, war movies. These were all genres that became popular during the silent period and then into the early sound era. And in many cases, they are still popular today. There's some other types of genres that maybe haven't lasted or they haven't really stayed with us in the same way that the book mentions. So, and again, some of these were more characteristic of early films, and we don't see them so much today. But back then, you might have had trick films, or of course, animated films. We still have those. Chase films, which might be like a short film where really all that happens is there's an extended chase sequence. Or even newsreels. We've mentioned before that back in, the 20s and 30s, if you went to the movie theater, you would often get an animated film or maybe a short newsreel playing before the feature attraction, before the feature-length movie that you really went to see. So those were all different kinds of movies. A trick movie or a trick film would have been characterized by some types of camera tricks that would have created sort of primitive special effects. And that really was how we would have referred to the film. Or if it's a newsreel reporting on current events, that's a newsreel. Animated film, that's a separate genre, and we still have those. But some of those have gone away, like newsreels were kind of replaced in later decades by television news and other mediums. People started getting their news from other sources, so we didn't really need those anymore, right? And as technology advanced, special effects got better, we didn't really have trick films in the same way. But we still have a lot of those other genres. So the book claims, and this is debatable, I think, but they claim that after World War I, movies are getting more specialized, more specific in terms of genre. And the two major genres that kind of emerge by the 1920s as the kind of powerhouse genres of that silent era were melodrama and comedy. I think we could add a few others. Westerns were popular back then and would continue to be. They were also what was back then kind of referred to as like swashbucklers or epics. I think we mentioned these briefly last week when I was discussing how different studios would sort of get associated with different genres. So like there'd be sort of different house styles that would come to be recognized within the studios. Like different studios would specialize in different kinds of movies with certain kinds of actors and other characteristics. So we mentioned swashbuckling epics starring actors like Errol Flynn. We can sort of think of those as early action movies, like sort of the ancestor of what we would now call action. The action genre. So we had those. But the book claims that melodrama and comedy really dominated a lot of the space. We still have comedies. We know what comedies are. It might be worth thinking a moment more about melodrama as a genre, because I don't think we really use that word so much anymore. I think the genre still exists, but we probably call it by different names now. And we've heard this term a few times because it was a very important genre at the very beginning of movies. Because remember, we know that a lot of early films were taking their plots, and in some cases, even some of their actors, directly from stage plays. And we've mentioned that one popular genre of late 19th century stage plays was melodrama. So a lot of early movies going all the way back to like the 1890s, the first decade of the 1900s, they were borrowing the plots of stage melodramas and simply, translating that stuff into the movie form. So what is a melodrama? I think a lot of us might sort of recognize it today as sort of like a soap opera, maybe. That's not a perfect comparison, but I think it's pretty close. This is a genre that often sort of incorporated heightened emotions, different kinds of relationships, also frequently romantic relationships, but also sort of troubled or fraught familial relationships. Often a love story would be involved. But melodramas had a lot of different kinds of plots. They were unified more in terms of like mood, or what we might think of today as like, their vibes, or how they felt, the kinds of emotions they were trying to evoke. So oftentimes melodramas featured heightened emotions. Big emotional scenes, surprising reveals, like, a long-lost twin brother emerges, or the wife that the protagonist thought was dead is actually still alive. So if you've ever watched soap operas like Days of Our Lives, or, those types of shows, like, a lot of this stuff remains with us, like these kinds of improbable plots, often involving like tortured romance, family secrets. Like, you've probably seen a movie like that or a TV show like that because the genre is still with us. But today we're more likely to just refer to those as dramas. In some cases, we might label them as romance or family drama. In the realm of TV, again, we've sort of used the term soap opera to refer to a lot of those types of plots over the years. So we don't really have one term to refer to all melodrama, but I think we recognize melodrama when we see it. And again, sometimes we'll just shorten it to drama. And sometimes we'll even use this term to refer to real life situations. We go home, there's drama in the house. That's kind of what we mean, right? People are having verbal confrontations. There's been a big reveal. Somebody's feelings are hurt. Somebody is jealous. Somebody is yelling. That's melodrama. Right, so we still have it, and it was popular in older novels, older plays, and then of course it shows up in movies, but then also comedies. And the book might confuse you at times because it talks about several different kinds of comedy. I would say nowadays we just sort of refer to comedy in a more broad sense, but we can still probably find or think of some subgenres of comedy. Romantic comedy, teen comedy, like there are different types. And the different types of comedy that existed back in the 20s and 30s, obviously a little bit different from how we might think of comedy today. But as we're watching the Marx Brothers, we should try to notice any features, any characteristics of their movie that might still show up in modern day comedy. And I think we can probably find a few. One interesting point the chapter makes is that there used to be kind of a different way of naming genres. So they talk about how, distributors and exhibitors, the people buying the movies and then the people showing the movies in movie theaters, originally would sort of use a two-part naming system, using an adjective and a noun to name genres. So they give a couple of examples, like musical attraction. So the noun is attraction, and the adjective is musical. The adjective is describing the noun. So this is an attraction. What kind of an attraction? A musical attraction. And that would be the way the genre would have been referred to, maybe back in the 19-teens or 20s, and even maybe into the 30s. In a similar way, we might get a Western melodrama. A lot of those elements of the melodrama that I just outlined, but the descriptor is Western. We're out west. We're in the Wild West. That's the adjective. The noun would be melodrama. But what happened by roughly the end of the silent era and the beginning of the sound era, so like the early 30s, we start dropping the noun and we just keep the adjective. And that's largely how a lot of these genres are known today. So we would refer to a musical, right? We would just drop the word attraction and the genre just comes to be known as musical. Any movie that has a lot of musical numbers, a lot of singing and dancing in the movie, that's just a musical, right? That's just what we would call it beginning around the 30s. Same with the Western. We don't have to call it a Western melodrama or a Western epic. We can just call it a Western. And we know what that means. We don't know exactly what the plot's going to be, but we have an idea. We know where the setting will be, and there's certain characteristics, there's certain genre conventions that we expect to find in a Western, right? We expect cowboys. We expect horses, right? We go in with certain expectations based on the fact that it's called a Western, right? So we're expecting certain things and we're going to respond to the movie, at least in part, based on whether or not we get those things that we expect and whether or not the movie does a good job of sort of capturing and replicating those familiar genre conventions or characteristics. So the adjective becomes more important, and that's increasingly how genres come to be known from the 30s onward. But just to make our understanding of genre a little bit more nuanced, it's worth going through this checklist that the chapter provides about all the different roles and functions that the concept of genre can fill, starting on the production level. So like we've said, this is the actual shooting of the movie. We're on set. The director's in charge. We're getting all of our shots. The actors are performing. We're getting all the footage that we're later going to edit and put together in a feature release that we can sell to distributors. So at the production level, genre can provide a lot of templates that they can follow, right? The screenwriters, the director, they're going to follow certain genre conventions, right? Based on what the genre is normally like. So that's going to have a big impact on the screenplay. Again, if we're writing a Western, we got to incorporate certain elements into that screenplay. Cowboys, bandits, horses, deserts, vistas. We have to get all that in there. And the director is also going to be aware of these familiar genre conventions. We're going to go and get some of our exterior shots, in Utah, where we have the right mountains and desert, right? So they're going to make certain decisions based on genre. based on what kind of movie they're making. And that would extend really to all creative personnel, not just the screenwriter, not just the director, but also the cinematographer, right? What kinds of camera shots are we going to get? What is the movie going to look like visually? That's going to depend on the genre, right? If we're doing a Western, we're going to be outside a lot. There's going to be action. Again, there's going to be desert and mountains and people on horseback. But if we're doing a melodrama set in 18th century France, we're going to be indoors, right? We're going to have different kinds of shots. We're going to have a different type of set, right? Think about art direction or production design, the people in charge of all the visual elements aside from camera work. So the genre is going to dictate what our sets look like, what our costumes look like, what the hair and makeup look like. So all of these elements that are important during production when the movie's actually getting made, all of that, or a lot of it, is going to be based on genre. And also, this is part of that sort of factory model, highly efficient, streamlined way of making movies that Hollywood perfects. Production teams could recycle certain things if they were making a popular genre that has already been done a lot before. So if I'm doing a Western, I can recycle certain sets from other Westerns that were also done for this particular studio. So we can recycle sets. We might be able to use some of the same costumes from earlier movies. We could even use some stock footage of Western landscapes, deserts, mountain peaks, river crossings. We could recycle some of that. Even certain sound effects that are going to are going to show up in a lot of different Westerns, we can recycle these. We can reuse these, which cuts down a little bit on production cost. And that's always important to the producers and the people working for the studios. So it's very important for production, but genre is also important at the distribution level, right? So once the movie is made and it's been sold to a distribution company or the distribution arm of the studio, because remember, a lot of Hollywood studios achieve vertical integration, which means they're in charge of production, distribution, and exhibition. But at the distribution stage, it's all about sales. It's all about selling the movie to the public. And we can really relate to this, I think, today, because movies are still sold to us. They are marketed to us in a certain way. So a lot of times this will be referred to as product differentiation. A big way you sell a product is by making it clear to the audience how this product is different from all the other products that are also on the market. What makes your product special? What makes it worth purchasing? Why should people want it? Well, that's the way movies got marketed as well. So certain genre characteristics, things that people liked about a particular genre, that's going to become an important point to make during the selling process, right? You're selling the public on the chases, the horseback scenes, right? Whatever those genre conventions are that people want, that's partly how you're selling the movie. And it's also how you can differentiate your movie from other movies in that same genre. This is one of the most thrilling Westerns of all time. It's better in some ways than the other Westerns, and here's how. So not only are you using certain parts of genre to sell the movie, you're also banking on the audience already possessing a lot of knowledge about the genre. See, that's interesting to think about too. These movie execs knew that they had audience members who had seen a lot of other movies in that genre. So that's also important when you're trying to sell something to them. Hey, we know you're familiar with this genre. We know you've seen a lot of Westerns, but you've never seen a Western like this. So that kind of idea was very important on the sales side. And then finally, if we're thinking just about audience, we're really thinking about the consumption of the movie. People going and watching the movie and the whole experience for the audience. That experience, like I said before, is largely shaped by their expectations and their desires. And those expectations and desires are largely shaped on what the audience already knows about the genre. And what they already know about the genre and how well this new movie fits into the genre is going to do a lot to shape not just their experience, but also how they understand the movie, right? And how they think about the movie, talk about the movie, and feel about it after they've seen it. So, just some different things to consider. Genre is important on a lot of different levels. It's not just a way to categorize. It's also something that drives production, it drives distribution, and it has a big impact on audiences as well. So again, if you're thinking about any genre, and we can get more modern, think about more modern genres. You can think about sci-fi, you can think about horror, you can think about westerns, war movies, soap operas. They all have certain characteristics, these genre conventions that show up in a lot of different movies belonging to that same genre. So these are often what we might call plot motifs, like certain features or things that happen in the plots that are very common. This is one of the ways that we can recognize genre, right? Certain plots, certain kinds of events happening in the plots. Also, maybe just like recurring images or visual styles. A Western will look very different than a sort of drawing room melodrama set in a previous historical period. They're going to have different visual styles, right? A musical will look different than a war movie. But it's not just about different subject matter. It's also different camera shots, different sets, different use of lighting, different costumes, different on a lot of different levels, visual levels, but also if we're thinking about the stories and how they unfold. So all of this sort of creates certain established conventions that audiences are aware of. So we saw the Great Train Robbery back in week 1. A lot of film scholars and historians claim that that movie and other really early Westerns helped to establish the genre conventions of all future Westerns, right? So certain aspects of the plot, the camera work, the costumes, all of that we saw in the Great Train Robbery helped to establish these templates for future Westerns. And we could see examples of that with other genres too. Particularly if we look at some of our early examples of sci-fi. And with the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, melodrama, with also some war movie and some maybe other generic elements thrown in. So genre matters to the people making the movies, genre matters to distributors, matters to exhibitors, and it definitely matters to audiences. But also, as the book points out, these sort of standardized genres also help to create these much more extensive sort of support systems for movies that really grew up during the silent era into the early sound era. So we were kind of talking about this a few weeks ago with the star system and how you had a whole sort of network that was created around star actors. They would have fan clubs. They would be featured in gossip columns. They would have their own, management and PR teams. So but even going beyond that, with genre, you would have, newspaper columns, fan clubs, commercial products, maybe even, like toys, things that were made to go along with specific kinds of movies, right? Also artwork, cartoons, other forms of media, different magazines and books that all sprouted up based on movie genres. Westerns, comedies, melodrama, whatever. So you had this whole vast system, including other media, including other things that Hollywood could sell to the public. And I think we still see examples of this, like corporate tie-ins or even new products created to kind of ride the coattails of a popular movie or a popular genre. When I was a kid, I remember having a Ghostbusters lunchbox. And that's kind of an earlier, not the first, but an earlier example of how you could get these products and other tie-ins based on a popular movie. The lunchbox didn't have anything directly to do with the movie, but it was produced and sold in large part, in sole part, because the movie was a hit. And people wanted to have something connected to the movie, something with the movie's theme attached to it. So you have this whole other sort of world of marketing and development and selling other products, all based on movies, and then, of course, the genres that those movies belong to. So I think all of that is worth thinking about a little bit more, and as the book points out, over time, as the genres become more and more familiar, more and more standardized, what starts to happen is, in some ways, the genre itself can play a major role in a film. Now, that doesn't maybe make sense to us yet, but I think as we get more modern in our films this semester, we're going to see some examples. We'll definitely see an example with The Last Action Hero, which I would argue is a movie that's very much about action movies. And you guys can probably think of other examples from recent years. Movies that are having a lot of fun with the genre conventions that they are supposed to be conforming to. So if you even think about a movie from the 90s like the original Scream, which has, of course, started a whole franchise. Scream, when it first came out, was kind of novel because it was a horror movie that was kind of making fun of horror movies. It had some comedic elements. It was also genuinely scary at times, but it was what we called maybe like a send-up or almost an homage to the genre. A celebration of the genre, but also movies like that could often be sort of playful with the genre. And this is all based on audience expectation, because the makers of the movie know that viewers have certain expectations based on the genre. In the case of Scream, it's a horror movie, right? So people go in with certain expectations based on all the other horror films that they've seen. When we go to watch horror, we have certain things we expect, certain things we want, both in terms of story, in terms of acting, in terms of all of those visual elements that I've mentioned, camera work, costumes, sets, whatever. Right? So the filmmakers can play around with those expectations. Sometimes they can give audiences what they want, but in other cases, they can upset expectations. They can surprise audiences by making them think that they're going to get something common to a horror movie, but instead they might end up getting something else. And movies like Scream often would sort of comment on the genre. In the case of the original, there's a character who's like an expert on horror movies. He's seen all the horror movies. So when weird things start happening to the friend group, he's sort of telling people what's going to happen based on his knowledge of movies. So sometimes that's funny, but then in other cases he's proven correct and it's scary. But there's this like knowledge on the part of the movie. Like, we know the genre that we belong to. We know what you, the audience, is expecting. And we're going to have fun with it. Sometimes we might go in a different direction. So we see a lot of that nowadays. Sometimes that's referred to as a characteristic of postmodern movies or art. Some people just would say that's a kind of modern preoccupation with a lot of movies, again, because these genres have been around for so long. You could think about a popular genre that we have today, like superhero movies, right? And how maybe a character like Deadpool or some Deadpool movies are commenting on the nature of superhero movies. And in some cases, they're kind of making jokes about superhero movies, or they're sort of aware of what audiences are expecting, and they can have fun with those expectations. So again, like the book says, audiences kind of get trained to expect certain things from genres. And they're also trained to respond to like certain cues or certain characteristics common in a genre. So that just means that they're familiar with the plots and they respond certain ways to events in the plots or to certain characters. So a good example that gets used a lot is if, say, you're watching a crime drama or a gangster movie, which is another old genre that's been around and popular for a long time. If you're watching a gangster movie and you're following a protagonist who is a criminal, who is committing criminal acts throughout the film, you might find yourself tolerating his bad or violent behavior because he might be a likable character, he might be charismatic in some way, or simply because that's what people do in gangster movies. They commit crimes. They kill each other. That's what you expect when you go into the movie. So when this character is doing terrible things that you would never accept from a person in real life, you are fine with it. You might even take pleasure in those criminal acts. And as a lot of critics point out, this really runs counter to accepted social standards, right? We would not accept that kind of behavior from any real person in our lives. If we saw somebody doing that, in our everyday life, we would respond with horror, or we might try to stop them or call the police. But in the movie, we enjoy it. In the movie, we might even pull for the criminal character to get away, because we've become attached to that character. Or we think maybe he's somewhat justified in doing some crime because another bad guy did something bad to him. So just an example of how genre trains us to think a certain way, to respond to things in a very specific way that's kind of unique to movies. Because again, we wouldn't respond to those same things in the same way if they were happening in real life. But in a movie, as a spectator, we enjoy them, right? Because we've been taught to enjoy them. We've been taught what that particular genre is all about. So for audiences, genre is like a sort of subconscious driving force in the way that we experience movies, think about movies, enjoy movies. But like I was saying, a lot of times we don't stop and really think that much about genre conventions or how certain genres train us to watch movies, but it's very much happening and it's very important. But for studio executives and producers, genres were essential to business. And as the book points out, they were often thought of as the main reason why an individual film was successful. So for a studio executive, a film would be successful not so much based on how creative it was, but more like how closely did it conform to the genre conventions, the genre formulas and templates that had been established. So if the Western was a big hit, that's because it captured all of those key Western characteristics. The studio exec or the producer might not have really thought that it was a particularly novel or creative film, but it captured all the things that audiences wanted. You had the right landscape. You had the right kinds of actors. You had the right kind of script. You had the right kinds of camera shots. So people were satisfied when they went to watch that movie. That's not typically how we think about movies maybe today. We I think, prioritize creativity and originality, but we still want certain genre conventions to be there. We might have a little bit more flexibility than the old studio executives 100 years ago, but we still have a lot of these same expectations. And if we go to watch a horror film and that horror film doesn't capture a lot of the horror conventions that we like, that might lead us to think that the movie wasn't very good, right? Without necessarily phrasing it that way, we might decide this horror movie didn't capture the formula of the horror genre well enough. And that might make us not like it. So that's about enough, I think, on genre. But the final thing I did want to mention, just because they're trying to predict the future, and it kind of reveals how dated this book is. In case you're wondering, the book was published during the 90s. So the history that it's telling really stops around the middle of the 1990s. But if you look on page 283, they're trying to predict the future of genres. And they predict that future genres will be largely created by audiences. So their argument is sort of like the classic genres that have been around forever. Those were really the creations of studios and screenwriters and directors, the people that made the movies. But in the future, genre might be determined more by audiences, the people who are paying to watch the movies. And they seem to think that that's going to happen, at least in part, because of new technologies. So they mention, and then again, some of this might make you chuckle because of the word choice. They mention satellite transmissions, so that's sort of like satellite TV, electronic mail, email, facsimile machines, I think that's like a fax machine, and cellular phones. So some of the technology that they're mentioning is obviously outdated, but when it comes to cell phones, and we could probably just add the internet, they're not wrong that these new technologies will have an important effect on genre. They just don't seem to really know exactly what those effects will be. But they also mention a fragmentation of media. A lot of different kinds of media, all existing somewhat separately, obviously drawing from one another, being influenced by one another, but existing separately for separate audiences. And I think they're right about that. A lot of media scholars and critics will argue that the media environment today is very fragmented, a lot more so than it used to be, just because there's more options for people, right? And this really starts with TV. We'll talk about that development in a few weeks. But TV is a big competitor to the movies, right? Because once TV comes along, you don't have to go to the movie theater to get this sort of entertainment. Maybe you can stay at home and just watch it on TV. That's a big change. And then later, home video, right? In the form of VHSs and then DVD. And then, of course, the era that we're living in now, thanks to the internet, streaming. Now, we don't even have to go to a video store and rent something like you did in my youth. You can just stream it on your device. So, as a result, everybody can sort of get their own media. We don't all participate in the same media. We're not all watching the same stuff to the extent that we would have been maybe back in the golden age of movies. So I do think that matters, but I would ask you guys to try to fill in this prediction that the editors of the book are unable to really drive home. Are they right? Do we think that new genres, new movie genres, we can also think of TV shows maybe, do we think there are new genres today that have been created largely based on audience demand, what people want? And we have all of these different fragmented audiences, and they all want different things. So has that created a bunch of new genres that have come around maybe in the last several decades? Just think about that, because it's kind of a fun thought exercise. All right, the last thing I will say, just to kind of link this back to written texts. We've all had some experience analyzing novels or other kinds of fiction, so sometimes it's nice to compare movies to written works of fiction. And we can do this when thinking about genre. So we can think about the semantic elements of a genre along with the syntax of that genre. And we can use these words in a similar way to how they are used when we're talking about novels or any kind of, writing. So you might know that when we talk about semantics, we're really just talking about the meaning of individual words, right? That's all we mean. So if we're having a semantic argument, we are arguing about what a particular word or a few words mean. What do they mean? What do they signify? So we have that on the level of words, right? So we have the word level, that's the semantic level. And then we have syntax. That really refers to sentence structure. So that's how we put together individual words into longer, more expressive formulas. So if we're reading a book, right, we can talk about semantic stuff. We can talk about individual words. Obviously, that's like the basic building block of any written text, individual words. But then we can also look at individual sentences. We can look at the larger syntax. How are those words being used? How are they being arranged? And how do they create larger meaning when put together? So that's often how we approach written text. Let's start on the semantic level, thinking about individual words, and then we can sort of graduate to the syntax and think more about entire sentences and eventually paragraphs. We can kind of do the same thing with movies. So again, if we're thinking about the Western genre, the semantic level of the Western genre would really be like individual elements, individual features or characteristics that we expect to find in a Western. So I've already mentioned a bunch of these. Horses, rough and tumble cowboys, maybe some illegal acts like a shooting or cattle rustling, tracking shots, a particular kind of camera technique that became very popular in Westerns to capture these impressive vistas, these huge open landscapes. We might even expect certain colors, right? We're in the desert. We're going to have a blue sky. We're going to have sand. We're going to have craggy mountain peaks, right? So these are all the semantic elements, individual things that we expect in a Western. And they refer to characters, plot, camera work, even the colors of the movie, right? That's the semantic level. And then if we go bigger to the syntax, if we're thinking about how all of those individual elements are put together, now we're thinking more about the entire plot. How are those rough and tumble cowboys on the horses doing the illegal acts? How is all of that pulled together in a coherent narrative? That's largely the plot, right? So we're looking at plot patterns. We're looking at visual motifs, recurring features that come to us through camera shots or certain colors or certain types of actions, chasing, horseback riding, fighting, shooting. How is all of that put together? All of those aesthetic choices, how are they all put together to create a story, to create a complete movie? So genre really does work on that level. You can isolate it at the semantic level, think about the individual pieces that we expect to show up in an example of that genre, and then we can think about the larger syntax. How are those features all put together to create sentences and paragraphs? And as the book points out, I think it's worth thinking about is that sometimes, and this kind of happens more later, when we get a little bit more playful with genre, maybe a little bit more postmodern, we can call it self-referential, calling attention to the genre that you belong to. One way more modern movies do that is they take a lot of those familiar semantic elements, the cowboys, the horses, the colors, the shots. They take all of those familiar semantic elements, but they change the syntax. The way they put all of that together creates a different narrative with different themes, and it might even cut in the opposite direction of classic examples of that genre. So that's kind of what I mean with more modern westerns or horror movies that are kind of commenting on their own genre, while still belonging to that genre, using a bunch of the semantic elements of that genre, but putting them all together to create a new syntax, a new message, a new theme, and a new experience. So I think we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that in the weeks to come as we get more modern. Okay, so let's wrap up today by talking about Duck Soup. So this is a popular comedy from the 1930s. We're actually going back a little ways. Our last movie, The Wizard of Oz, was from 1939. So we've gone back to 1933 for Duck Soup. But we are still in that first decade of sound. And the Marx Brothers were very popular throughout the 20s, 30s, really into the 1940s and beyond. They haven't been completely forgotten today, but a lot of modern viewers might not be super familiar with them. However, I bet you have seen them before. Even if you've never seen any of their movies, they had a bunch of movies going all the way back to the late 20s and extending, I believe, through the 40s. Even if you've never seen a single one, you've probably seen Groucho Marx, the main guy, the main character in this movie. You've probably seen him before. Or you've maybe seen a cartoon version of his face. There's even a popular emoji. I don't know if it's popular anymore, but there is like a Groucho emoji that you can often use on a lot of phones. He's become much like Metropolis, much like The Great Train Robbery, much like A Voyage to the Moon. These are old movies and old performers that maybe have been forgotten, but certain images associated with them live on. And they've been removed from their original context. So we might experience some of these images and not know where they came from. A lot of you had that experience with Metropolis or A Voyage to the Moon. Like, oh, I've seen that picture or I've seen that shot. I've seen that performer, but I didn't know where it came from. Now you do. So the Marx Brothers might give us another chance to kind of do that. So they were old vaudeville performers. They actually got their start in the pre-movie days, or at least pre-sort of feature-length narrative movies. They were on the stage before they transitioned to movies. So a lot of their act is sort of a holdover from older vaudeville shows. And I've mentioned vaudeville before. It really dates back to like the 19th century, and you would have little comical skits and often like musical numbers, and you'd have a lot of different things, kind of like variety shows. But often comedy was a big part of vaudeville, especially physical comedy. And that was one of the specialties of the Marx Brothers. They did a lot of physical comedy that we might refer to today as slapstick. And we still see slapstick comedy. It has not left. It's still a part of the genre. Maybe not as big of a part as it was before. If you checked out some of those silent movie clips of like Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin, you'll notice that this was kind of a tradition going back to the silent era for obvious reasons, right? Before we had sound, before the actors could say funny things, we really needed physical comedy. That was going to come through whether we had sound or not. So the origins of a lot of this slapstick comedy go back to vaudeville, pre-movie types of art forms, but they were also popular during the silent era. And they continued to be popular into the sound era, but increasingly slapstick just becomes one part of a bigger comedy movie. I think that's normally how we experience it today. Like a lot of mainstream popular comedies today will have some elements of slapstick, but that's not the whole movie. But it's not the whole movie here either. We have slapstick on one hand, and that largely comes from Harpo and Chico Marx, the two spies that are very inept and get into all these difficult situations. They give us a lot of slapstick, but then we also get a lot of verbal comedy, largely from Groucho, who was sort of the star and the featured attraction of the brothers. There's actually 4 brothers. Sometimes there's only 3 that appear, but in this movie, we get all 4. Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Zeppo, who has a smaller role. But Groucho delivers a lot of the verbal comedy that's often based on puns and wordplay, some of it a little bit risque, at least for the time period. This movie comes out right before that new rating system that I was talking about last week fully goes into effect, which is, I believe, 1934. This movie comes out in 1933. So some of their jokes would not have made it past the censors after that new rating system got established, but they were able to get away with it in 33. So Groucho talks very fast. Almost everything he says is a joke or it's sarcastic. So we get that verbal side, and then we get a lot of the physical comedy from his brothers. They really were brothers in real life, and they rarely played brothers in the movies. In the movies, they're usually unrelated to each other, but they were actually brothers. And we get a lot of the physical comedy from Harpo. And he's the blonde guy who at one point is like playing the piano, like playing the strings. He's an accomplished musician. A lot of their movies featured him doing some kind of musical performance. You don't get as much of that in this one, but he's almost entirely silent. And almost all of their movies, Harpo virtually never speaks. He plays music. Sometimes he makes weird noises, but he almost never speaks. So his brand of comedy really is almost purely physical. And then you have Chico, who in the movie plays Ciccolini. And for some strange reason, in many of their movies, he's playing like a rustic Italian character. They were not Italian in real life, but he's often playing some vaguely Italian man. So in this movie, Chico is Ciccolini and Harpo is Pinky. And they're the two inept spies that we follow throughout the movie. And Groucho plays Firefly, the new ruler of the fictional nation of Fredonia. So, pretty silly, pretty goofy, but I want you guys to try to pick out some familiar comedy elements that we might still see today in a modern day comedy. So we're going to see a lot of sight gags, and that might remind you of some other movies. A sight gag is humor conveyed visually, usually with no words. So again, we get a lot of that, especially when Harpo is involved. So there's some really famous like set pieces or extended gags that became pretty famous from this movie. And a lot of times they're relying mostly on sight gags. So one famous example is the lemonade vendor, who's played by this guy Edgar Kennedy, who was himself an old comedian from silent movies and vaudeville. He wasn't quite as popular as the Marx Brothers, but audiences in the 30s would have recognized him. So he plays the lemonade vendor who Ciccolini and Pinky are just sort of harassing and tormenting in various ways. So that extended sequence where they're like stealing his hat and doing all of these like silly things with him, that's largely sight gags. And that's a long set piece. There is a little bit of talking. I think we hear the vendor like say a few things like, I'm gonna wring your neck. But for the most part, it's, reliant on physical comedy. And we're seeing what the brothers are doing with his hat. And it's funny, and it kind of drives him crazy. That's a recurring feature of this kind of comedy. It's a recurring feature with the Marx Brothers where usually the characters played by Chico and Harpo are doing these elaborate sight gags, and in so doing, they drive the victim of their gag sort of insane. Like that's kind of a recurring feature. They get these people very frustrated and flustered with their physical comedy. So the lemonade vendor is a famous set piece, like an extended scene that kind of stands on its own as a good example of the Marx Brothers sort of absurd brand of comedy. Also the mirror scene where and this is a very sort of famous sequence where we have Harpo and Chico both dressed up as Groucho. So all three of them look alike, and they're being mistaken for each other at various times. And we have that scene where Groucho comes down the stairs, and he thinks that he's seeing a reflection of himself in the mirror, but he's actually seeing Pinky, the Harpo character, dressed like Groucho. And unbeknownst to the real Groucho, Pinky has broken the mirror by running into it. So now Pinky's simply standing in the other room trying to mirror all of the movements of the Groucho character. And then eventually Ciccolini shows up and it becomes even more chaotic. But that's another famous scene. Again, almost entirely silent, right? That whole mirror scene is strictly reliant on sight gags. There's really no talking, there's no dialogue or sound to speak of. And then the most famous scene of the movie is the final battle scene that takes up really like the final 8 minutes. And it's often held up as a really monumental achievement of early cinematic comedy. One funny sight gag that you might notice in that sequence is that the Groucho character, who's playing the leader of Fredonia, he keeps changing costumes. You might not notice that if you're not looking for it, but I'll give you that tip. Throughout the scene, every time like something changes or we get a cutaway and then we come back to Firefly, he's dressed differently. And they're all like different military outfits. So one is like a Confederate, officer from the Civil War. One is like a French soldier from the time of Napoleon. And then at one point he's wearing a Boy Scout outfit. So that's supposed to be funny, absurd. Again, humor conveyed solely through visuals. He never comments on the costumes, and nobody else does either. That's often thought of as part of the secret that makes it so funny, is that it never gets acknowledged. It never gets explained. He just keeps changing clothes and everybody else acts like that's normal. So that's pretty famous. There's also running gags, like visual gags that show up multiple times. They recur throughout the film. So one of the famous ones in here is Harpo as Pinky driving off in a motorcycle, leaving Firefly alone in the detached sidecar. So we see that more than once, right? So again, setting up audience expectations and then delivering what they want, right? If it's funny once, it might be funny a second or even a third time. Another thing that some people talk about with this movie is that it's kind of a political farce, or in some cases it's referred to as a satire. The Marx Brothers themselves were pretty clear that they didn't have a very specific political message, but they were responding to real events, like things that were actually happening in the world. In this case, the fascist takeover of the Italian government, which was going on in the early 1930s. So in some ways, the Firefly character is kind of supposed to be a very comical, ridiculous version of Mussolini, who was the new fascist leader of Italy. So they are kind of making fun of Mussolini. They're making fun of his political movement, and apparently Mussolini himself was aware of the movie and was not pleased with the portrayal, and that made the Marx Brothers very happy. But they went out of their way, particularly Groucho, who kind of spoke for all of them, as saying, we don't really have a political message, we're just making fun of these people. So, but I do think there's some relevance to the larger plot or the theme, if we can even, find one. It's obviously designed for laughs. It's designed to be ridiculous, but we see a leader who is not very effective. We see a country descend into chaos. We see a pointless war. We see some things that did have relevance, especially, again, if we think about the time period. We're less than a decade away from World War II. So Mussolini wasn't the only authoritarian leader taking control in Europe around this time. We have Franco in Spain, and of course soon we'll have Hitler in Germany. So they're not directly commenting on all of that, but they are sort of giving us a glimpse at the chaos that can happen when a bad or immoral leader takes control. Now, Firefly, I think, is mostly just depicted as inept, silly, and kind of uninterested in leading. But there is sort of a larger point, even though it's all comedy here. It's like, chaos is coming in Europe. It really was. Bad leadership, overly ambitious or war-mongering leaders would eventually lead to World War II, and of course the U.S. would eventually get involved. So some people call it a political farce, where there maybe really is a political message. Others just think it's a silly comedy and they're making fun of Mussolini. But just, keep in mind, Fredonia, Sylvania, these are not real countries, but they're kind of made to sound like real countries. So the Marx Brothers do want their audience to kind of think about Europe and to think about what was really going on in Europe during that time. You'll notice we have some elements of the musical genre. We have a couple of musical numbers, some songs performed during the movie, one big set piece early, and then another one kind of near the end, right before the climactic battle scene. Also, a lot of famous performers are in this movie in addition to the Marx Brothers. So I mentioned Edgar Kennedy, another comedian from the silent era in vaudeville. Margaret Dumont, who plays Mrs. Teasdale. She appears in a lot of Marx Brothers movies. She's often like the straight player, the serious actor who's contrasted to the hijinks of the brothers. Lewis Calhern shows up as the ambassador to Slovenia. He was a pretty famous actor, often featured in melodramas. Again, kind of a serious actor who's using his image to kind of have fun here in this movie. Raquel Torres plays Vera, another spy. Vera, I think, who we see in the film as well, kind of a femme fatale, another spy working behind the scenes with Calhern's character as they're trying to plot some insurrection. Torres is interesting because she was an early Mexican-American actress who becomes very popular in Hollywood. This was actually one of her last movies. But back then, movie industry was not super diverse, so Torres often played exotic characters in this movie. She's supposed to be some vaguely European person, but she often plays non-American characters. She was quite popular, but stopped acting not long after this. This was one of her first roles. And again, Groucho is the star. Harpo's the really weird blonde guy. Chico is the kind of Italian guy. And then Zeppo, the fourth and least known brother, plays Roland, who is Firefly's secretary. He's not particularly funny, but we do see him in a lot of the scenes. In that final battle scene, he's fighting alongside Ciccolini in Firefly. So that's Zeppo. He really wasn't as much of a performer. He was more behind the scenes, kind of helped manage their business, interests throughout their career. But we see him as well. So hopefully it was funny. You might not have been laughing out loud, but try to compare this to modern comedy and try to pick out some of those genre conventions of the comedy that we can see here and we can still see today in modern films. And that's it. I will see you next week.